Thank you for tuning in into channel 342, where we deliver you rad news. I'm your host for this evening, and tonight we have a special segment that we would like to present to you. Billions of lights across the Earth's night sky, and what do you see? Stars. It was theorized that the Earth was formed billions of years ago by a phenomenon known as the Big Bang, and evidence of that is right here on Earth. It's a tiny little rock called uranium. Now, at first glance, it looks like any other rock, but this rock was a key element for the U.S. nuclear weapons and energy program during the early 1940s. The United States took a keen interest in acquiring large amounts of this rock that they purchased it from other countries and put individuals at home to work and mine these tiny rocks. From the late 1940s to the late 1960s, individuals would mine these tiny rocks unaware of the potential dangers the tiny rock holds. It was a devastating instrument of death, weaponized in World War II, and can also be fatal by just being around the rock. Imagine that the whole world was Superman, and this uranium tiny rock was the world's kryptonite. Uranium-238 is a naturally occurring isotope that emits gamma rays. Its half-life is said to be 4.5 billion years and is what scientists believe to have been the remnants of what the Earth was formed billions of years ago. As uranium decays, it emits a radioactive gas known as radon. This gas produces radioactive matter known as alpha particles, which is the most harmful if introduced inside the body. However, protection from this type of radiation can be stopped by a simple piece of paper outside the body. The harmful effects of uranium were known as early as 1556, but the U.S. neglected to inform the miners of the hazards of mining due to uprise and the possibility for these workers to request for hazard pay. At the time, the miners were not informed of the harmful effects and were paid minimum wage to mine the material without any personal protective equipment. Locations of the mines were primarily in Utah and Colorado, where miners were constantly exposed to ionizing radiation and radon gas without their knowledge for years. As Father Time likes to educate us, the effects of being exposed to radiation started to surface and present as cancerous diseases in forms such as lung cancer many years after they stopped working in the mines. I would now like to pass it off to our channel's investigative journalist, Robert Marania, and our resident radioactive occupational hazards expert, Alexander Chan, who just recently authored a book telling American Uranium Miners and Radon Gas, Silent but Deadly, that uncovers this deadly piece of history.
Hey everybody, thank you Roland. That was a wonderful introduction there. Tonight we have a special guest, like he said, Alexander Chan. Alex, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Alex. Alex, first, I would like to thank you for taking time out of this crazy pandemic to shed light on radiation and mining in the United States. If you don't mind, just give our audience a brief description and introduction of who you are and what your book entails.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for having me on. My name is Alexander Chan. I recently wrote a book known as The American Uranium Miners and Radon Gas, Silent but Deadly. And so pretty much what I'm here to tell you about is this issue that a lot of Americans are unaware of, the history of early American uranium miners and the conditions that they were subjected to, the dangers of radon gas, and where we are now as a society.
Thank you, thank you. So Alex, let's dive in by having you explain the U.S. uranium mining during the early 1940s and through the years. Why was it such a huge emphasis?
Right. So as Roland had explained earlier, the uranium mining in the United States began in 1942 for the nuclear weapons testing in World War II, and it went unchecked up until about 1971. And then again, at that time, the United States government was the sole purchaser for that uranium, for uranium radioactive power and for nuclear weapons during the Cold War. And primarily, those sites were in Southwest United States, in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas areas, that primarily employed poor Americans and Native Americans to put the country back to work during a post-war recession. The peak operation times for these mines were in the 1950s, with 750 active mines during that time, with many of those mines actually found on reservation land.
Interesting enough. So just to clarify, so you mean to say they were exploiting these people without really knowing the detrimental effects that mining could cause? Would you mind discussing all the knowledge you have gained through your research in regards to the dangers associated with this type of occupation?
Right, and that's what we briefly covered with the intro by Roland. Radon gas is a naturally formed radioactive decay process of uranium. Radon gas produces alpha particle radiation, which is a colorless and odorless radioactive source. The mining operations release these pockets of radon gas into the mine. And since early mines were naturally ventilated with an entrance port and an exit port, these dangerous radioactive pockets were able to cool up for the miners to work in during their conditions. There was no warning of radon gas dangers, and there was no PPE provided. In fact, there was a propaganda campaign started by the mining corporations in 1959 to stem some of the worker complaints that were starting to arise. Now, these alpha particles from the radon gas are not dangerous when outside of the body, only when it penetrates inside the body and affects the sensitive tissues of the respiratory tract and the lungs does it become a problem. So there are two ways that radiation affects the body. The first being deterministic effects. They manifest after a large dose in a short period of time. And then there are stochastic effects, which appear after a long period of time through successive small dose exposures. So these miners were subjected to stochastic effects that consists of carcinogenesis, genetic effects, and effects that come about to your tissues after several years, maybe even decades. And so due to these small doses in a successive period of time, working the mines over years, for days, for weeks, without any proper PPE or knowledge, these stochastic effects do appear later in life. In fact, the average latency period for the lung cancer, which is the primary stochastic effect, found was 14 years later after their initial exposure. So we know that the high energy radiation energy found in radon gas transfers to the sensitive tissues of the throat, the trachea, the respiratory tract, and causes cancer over time by directly interacting with the DNA of those sensitive structures. And that leads to carcinogenesis, like I said, which will appear later in life. We do know that this stochastic effect follows a linear non-threshold dose model response. And so pretty much what that states is that the more dose you are subjected to, the increase of probability to develop cancer. And then that just reflects on the conditions that these miners were subjected to, working for so many days, so many weeks, so many years without developing any symptoms and without even knowing that they were putting themselves in danger.
Wow. Now, for the general audience purpose, go ahead and break down some of the numbers for us. We now know that these conditions were dangerous. So what were the chances that these early miners or these early uranium miners were likely to develop cancers and other disorders?
Yeah, Rob, that's a great question. And I'm pretty sure that's what everyone wants to know. So these are the statistics found within my research. These miners had a mortality ratio 5 times higher to develop lung cancer than the general population. they were 6 times more likely to die from lung cancer than the general population. The cohort study that I found of the uranium miners from Colorado consists of 4,137 participants, and 72% of these participants died before 2008 due to lung cancer or respiratory tract complications. So they do have a probability that is higher, that this percentage is higher due to retrospective studies that rely on intact and accurate death certificates, which inevitably get damaged or lost over time. And that's not where it stops. In fact, these miners had a 2.5 times more likely chance to develop benign non-specific cancers, such as fibrosis of the lungs and pneumoconiosis. And they also had a 2.5 times chance higher to develop blood-based cancers, such as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and leukemia. Now, unfortunately, we are unable to prove that radon gas causes the non-specific cancers and blood-based cancers, since there are a lot of confounding variables within the research, since mining operations and occupation usually have an increased chance to develop these cancers and diseases with constant and regular exposure to silica, mineral dust, diesel fumes, and history of smoking. So while we do have correlation, we're unable to prove causation between these.
Wow, that's quite profound. Can you go ahead and break it down a little further and put it into perspective for the audience? Those morbidity and mortality rates are shockingly high. The conditions these miners must have worked in must have been incredibly dangerous.
Right, Robert, and they were increasingly dangerous. So to put it in perspective, the average American household, to measure radioactivity within the house, has 50 to 150 becquerels per meter squared. So in every meter by meter by meter, there's 150 of these decay processes occurring. So, and that's in the average household. Now, in these older mines, they had readings as high as 92,000 becquerels per meter squared in 1950. So those were in those early miners, and those early mines were being producing the uranium. Now, 150 becquerels per meter squared to 92,000 becquerels per meter squared. I'm no mathematician. That's a pretty big spread. In fact, it's 613 times larger of a spread than the average American household. And as we covered, no level of dose is safe. So we really want to try and minimize that exposure to radiation to minimize your probability of developing cancer, which these miners unfortunately didn't have a choice in deciding for themselves. So imagine working 5, 6, 7 days a week in these mines for several years, constantly exposing yourself to these radioactive conditions without any proper PPE or knowledge, without developing any symptoms for years.
Oh, wow. Alex, that is remarkable and shocking. Clearly, something has been done by Congress to regulate this dangerous industry. Now, the harm has been done, but what has been done to rectify this occupational hazard?
Okay, so where has that brought us now? So far, we have made some great strides in protecting radiation workers and miners in the United States. So we passed a law in 1969 following public pressure to mandate mechanical ventilation within the mines that uses positive pressure to suck out the radon gas and lower those radiation concentrations, while also mandating PPE requirements for the miners. In 1987, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health published a paper that recognized the link between radon gas and the risk factor for developing lung cancer, and the government's inability to step in and regulate the operations within these mines that they are employing. The task force created from this paper passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, otherwise known as RECA, in 1990, to reimburse these families for the medical costs and bills that had accumulated over the years due to the conditions that the government had subjected them to in the mines. So there were some compensations passed out to the families and the miners, but they were dealing with these medical costs for decades with no assistance from the government for these radioactive situations that they were put in. Now, however, there is a positive note out of this, that even though this difficult situation is hard to comprehend, that the government knew of these dangers and so willingly put these miners into unsafe radiation practices and workspace conditions, there were these positive laws and regulations passed. So they helped lay the foundation for the safe working conditions that radiation occupation workers work in today.
That was great information, Alex. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. The book for everyone is American Uranium Miners and Radon Gas, Silent but Deadly. It is now at your neighborhood bookstore, so please pick up a copy. Again, Alex, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
A rock, a tiny rock. Who knew how devastating a tiny rock could be? But as you know, time is the most valuable commodity that we possess as human beings. It teaches us patience. It allows us to learn from our previous mistakes, and in this case, it helped us develop new laws to protect individuals from the harmful effects of mining uranium without protective equipment. I can feel your frustrations from where you were sitting and how the government chose not to inform the miners of the dangers of uranium. But remember, these conditions led to an uprising and gave rise to new regulations to protect workers. And without these regulations, miners and those managing uranium wouldn't be protected today. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you. Channel 342 News.